I have spent 417 days watching the creature's hands, and I can tell you with absolute certainty that I still do not know the answer. No one does. No one ever will. But I have begun to suspect. And this is what terrifies me, what keeps me from sleeping, what has driven me to write these words in the desperate hope that someone might read them before they find me. That the question itself is wrong. We have been asking whether the Jokaero understands what it builds. We should have been asking whether the Jokaero understands what we are, and what it has been building us into. My name is Soren Vale. I was a cogitator analyst attached to the Ordo Xenos vessel Perpetual Inquiry, assigned to document the behavioral patterns of a captured Jokaero specimen designated XB-17. The Inquisitor who commanded our expedition believed that systematic observation might unlock the secrets of Jokaero techno, savantism, that if we watched carefully enough, recorded thoroughly enough, analyzed with sufficient rigor, we might finally understand how these Xenos produce technology that rivals the greatest works of the Mechanicus without any apparent comprehension of underlying principles. I was chosen for this task because my psychological profile indicated exceptional patience and attention to detail. I was considered ideal for long-term observation duties. I was considered stable. The Perpetual Inquiry was a modified frigate that had served the Ordo Xenos for 3 centuries, its corridors worn smooth by generations of investigators pursuing the mysteries of alien minds. The Jokaero containment chamber was located in the ship's deep core, surrounded by null field generators and psychic dampeners that served no purpose against a species with no warp presence but which protocol demanded nonetheless. The chamber itself was spacious by shipboard standards, perhaps 20 meters across, with curved walls lined with every manner of raw material the creature might desire. Metals in ingot form, crystals of varying composition, plastics and ceramics and compounds I could not identify. All of it provided freely, because the Inquisitor understood that a Jokaero denied materials becomes listless and unproductive, while a Jokaero given abundance creates wonders. I remember the first time I entered the observation gallery and saw XB-17 through the reinforced armor glass. The creature sat in the chamber's center, surrounded by the detritus of previous creations, devices that had already been catalogued and removed for study, leaving only scattered components and half-finished mechanisms. It was smaller than I had expected, perhaps the size of a large simian from ancient Terra, covered in rust, orange fur that had grown patchy and dull in captivity. Its face was flat and expressionless, dominated by large amber eyes that caught the chamber's artificial light and held it, gleaming with what might have been intelligence or might have been nothing at all. It held a piece of copper wire in its long, dexterous fingers, bending it into shapes that seemed random but which I would later learn were anything but. The observation gallery was my domain. A curved desk held 7 cogitator terminals, each dedicated to different aspects of analysis: movement tracking, material consumption, output classification, behavioral notation, pattern recognition, comparative reference, and one terminal that simply recorded everything, feeding data into the ship's archives for future study. I was expected to spend 12 hours each day at these terminals, watching, documenting, attempting to find meaning in the creature's endless tinkering. The other 12 hours I was free to sleep, eat, and pursue whatever diversions the ship offered, though in practice I found myself returning to the gallery during my rest periods, unable to stop watching, unable to look away from those amber eyes and those impossibly skilled hands. The first week established what I believed was normal. XB-17 would wake at irregular intervals. It seemed to have no circadian rhythm, no predictable sleep cycle, and immediately begin working. It would select materials with apparent randomness, gathering metals and crystals and components into piles around its workspace, then begin assembling them into devices. The speed was extraordinary. Within hours, it would produce objects that our tech priests required months to analyze and years to replicate. A digital weapon capable of disintegrating matter at the molecular level, a force field generator smaller than my thumbnail, a navigation device that could calculate warp routes with terrifying precision. Each creation emerged from those orange, furred hands as if it had always existed, as if XB-17 was not building but merely revealing something that had been hidden in the raw materials all along. I documented everything. I noted the sequence in which it selected materials. I tracked the movements of its fingers, recording each bend and twist and connection. I catalogued every completed device and the time required for its construction. I searched for patterns, for repetition, for any indication that the creature followed a process I might decode. But there was nothing, or rather there was everything, such complexity of behavior that it defied systematic analysis, such variance in approach that no two creations followed the same methodology. The tech priests who periodically reviewed my reports grew frustrated with my inability to extract useful principles. They wanted schematics, they wanted formulas, they wanted to understand how the Jokaero did what it did so they might do the same. I could only tell them what I observed, which was a creature that worked by instinct so profound it resembled omniscience. The first anomaly occurred on day 23. I was reviewing the previous day's recordings, watching XB-17 assemble what would later be identified as a communications device capable of penetrating warp storms, when I noticed something that made me pause the playback. The creature had stopped working. This was not unusual. It often paused to rest or consume the nutrient paste we provided, but this pause was different. XB-17 had set down its tools and turned to face the observation gallery. It was looking directly at the recording picked capture. It was looking, I realized with a chill that started in my spine and spread outward, directly at me. I told myself this was coincidence. The gallery was shielded. The armor glass was one way, opaque from the creature's perspective, transparent from mine. There was no way XB-17 could know it was being observed, let alone identify the specific location of the picked capture feeding my terminal. And yet it sat there, amber eyes fixed on a point that would have been my face if the barriers between us were not there, for 17 minutes and 43 seconds. Then it returned to work as if nothing had happened, and I returned to my documentation with hands that would not stop trembling. I did not include this incident in my official reports. I told myself it was insignificant, an artifact of random behavior that I was anthropomorphizing into intention. Jokaero did not think the way humans thought. They did not plan or observe or calculate. They simply built, driven by genetic imperatives that produced technological marvels through processes we could not comprehend. This was established xenological doctrine. This was what the Inquisitor believed, what the tech priests insisted upon, what every record of Jokaero behavior confirmed. The creatures were savants, not sentients. Tools, not thinkers. The fact that one had appeared to look at me meant nothing. The second anomaly occurred on day 41. I was watching XB-17 work on a new device, something with multiple focusing crystals arranged around a central power core, when it paused again. This time, instead of simply staring, it reached into the pile of materials beside it and extracted a small piece of reflective metal. Slowly, deliberately, it positioned this metal so that it caught the observation gallery's lighting and reflected it back toward the armor glass. The reflection moved across the darkened surface of the barrier, tracking left to right, until it stopped precisely on the spot where I was sitting. It held there for 11 minutes and 8 seconds, a tiny point of light marking my location with impossible accuracy, before the creature set the metal aside and returned to its construction. I began to have difficulty sleeping after that. When I closed my eyes, I saw amber irises gleaming in the darkness. When I dreamed of hands orange, furred hands that worked ceaselessly, building things I could not identify from materials I could not name, while those eyes watched me from shadows that grew deeper with each passing night. I increased my observation hours, telling myself I needed more data, that more documentation would help me understand what was happening, that the patterns would become clear if I simply watched long enough. I knew, even then, that I was lying to myself. I was not increasing my hours to understand XB-17. I was increasing my hours because I could not stop watching it, because something in those amber eyes had caught me and would not let go. Day 57 brought the third anomaly, and with it the end of any pretense that what I was witnessing was random behavior. I arrived at the observation gallery to find XB-17 already awake and working, which was not unusual. What was unusual was what it was building. The device taking shape under its fingers was unlike anything in our catalogs, unlike anything the tech priests had ever documented from Jokaero construction. It was small, perhaps the size of my fist, with a casing of burnished copper and a lens of deep violet crystal. As I watched, XB-17 made final adjustments to its internal workings, then held it up to examine its creation, and then, with movements that could not possibly be coincidental, it turned the device toward the observation gallery, aimed the violet lens directly at my terminal, and pressed what could only be an activation stud. The device did nothing visible. No beam of light, no discharge of energy, no sound or vibration that my instruments could detect. But I felt something, a pressure behind my eyes, a warmth in my temples, a sensation like fingers pressing gently against the inside of my skull. It lasted only a moment, less than a second, and then XB-17 set the device aside and began dismantling it, returning its components to the material piles as if it had served its purpose and was no longer needed. I sat frozen at my terminal for hours afterward, trying to understand what had happened, trying to convince myself it was imagination, trying to ignore the fact that my hands had begun to shake in ways I could not control and would not stop. I should have reported this. I should have told the Inquisitor immediately, should have submitted to psychic screening, should have removed myself from observation duties. These were the protocols. These were the requirements for anyone who suspected Xenos' influence. But I did not report, I did not tell anyone. Because even then, even in my fear and confusion, I did not want to stop watching. I did not want to be taken away from those amber eyes and those miraculous hands. Something had changed in me during that moment when the violet light touched my mind, and I could not bring myself to undo it, could not bear the thought of returning to who I had been before. The weeks that followed were the most productive of my assignment. I documented more in that period than in all my previous observations combined, not because XB-17's behavior had changed, but because I was beginning to see patterns that had been invisible before. The creature's material selection was not random. It followed sequences that repeated across constructions, mathematical progressions that governed which elements it chose and in what order. Its construction techniques were not instinctive improvisations but variations on fundamental methods, adapted to different purposes but rooted in consistent principles. I filled report after report with insights that made the tech priests finally begin to take my observations seriously, that earned me commendation from the Inquisitor, that seemed to justify everything I had endured. I did not tell them how I was seeing these patterns. I did not tell them about the headaches that had become constant, the pressure behind my eyes that never quite faded, the dreams that had grown so vivid I sometimes could not distinguish them from waking. I did not tell them that when I watched XB-17's hands work, I sometimes felt my own fingers twitch in sympathy, mimicking movements I should not have been able to perceive, tracing patterns in the air that matched what the creature was building on the other side of the armor glass. I did not tell them because I was afraid they would make it stop, and I had begun to understand, in ways I could not articulate, in ways that terrified me even as they fascinated me, that stopping was no longer possible. Day 112 marked the first time I found the artifact. I had been sleeping poorly, as had become normal, when I woke suddenly in my quarters with the absolute certainty that something was wrong. My hands were dirty, stained with lubricant and metal filings, the kind of residue that accumulated in the observation gallery, but which I had no business carrying to my bed. My fingernails were torn. My muscles ached as if I had been working for hours, and on my desk, placed with careful precision exactly where I would see it upon waking, was a device. It was small, smaller than my palm, with a casing of blackened steel and internal workings I could see through a transparent panel on one side. Tiny gears moved within it, powered by nothing I could identify, turning in patterns that seemed random but which I somehow knew were not. I had never seen this device before. I had no memory of building it. But the lubricant under my fingernails matched the compound on its casing, and the metal filings caught in my skin matched its construction materials, and when I held it in my hands, it felt familiar in a way that made me want to scream. I destroyed it. I took it to the ship's incinerator chute, and I dropped it into the flames, and I watched until I was certain nothing remained. Then I returned to my quarters, and I scrubbed my hands until they bled, and I told myself it had been a dream, a fugue state brought on by exhaustion and stress, something that would not happen again if I simply took better care of myself. I requested medical evaluation. I cited overwork. The ship's medici prescribed rest and mild sedatives and noted nothing unusual in my cognitive scans. I returned to my duties 3 days later, and for a while everything seemed normal. The second artifact appeared on day 131. This time I found it not upon waking, but during my observation shift, tucked into a storage compartment of my terminal desk that I had not opened in weeks. It was different from the first, cylindrical, with spiral grooves cut into its surface and a core of amber crystal that pulsed with faint light. I did not remember building it. I did not remember hiding it. But when I held it, my fingers fit perfectly into the grooves, as if the device had been made specifically for my hands, and when I looked through the amber crystal, I saw the observation gallery differently, saw lines of force I had never noticed before, saw patterns in the air that connected my terminal to the armor glass to the chamber beyond, saw XB-17 looking back at me through the barrier with eyes that now seemed to glow with the same amber light. I destroyed this one too. I destroyed the third artifact and the fourth and the seventh and the 12th, each one more sophisticated than the last, each one appearing in places I could not remember visiting during gaps in time I could not account for. My hands grew calloused from work I did not recall performing. My quarters accumulated materials, scraps of metal, crystal shards, lengths of wire that I had no memory of acquiring. My dreams became blueprints, technical specifications for devices I did not understand, assembly sequences that played behind my closed eyes with perfect clarity, and through it all, through every waking moment and every restless sleep, I could feel XB-17 watching me. Not through the armorglass now, through something else, something deeper. Day 189 was when I discovered the records. I was searching the ship's archives for previous studies on Jokaero behavior, hoping to find some precedent for what I was experiencing, some explanation that did not involve accepting what I had begun to suspect. Instead, I found something worse. The perpetual inquiry had housed 17 Jokaero specimens over its 3 centuries of service. 17 creatures, each one assigned an observer, each one studied and documented and eventually transferred or terminated when deemed no longer useful. 17 observers, whose records I now read with growing horror. The first observer had lasted 203 days before suffering what the records called cognitive dissolution. The second had managed 178 days before being found dead in his quarters. Surrounded by devices of unknown purpose, his hands worn to the bone from work his body had not survived. The third observer made it 240 days before walking into the ship's plasma drives, leaving behind a note that contained nothing but technical specifications for a machine that had never been built. Each record told the same story with different details. Each observer had experienced the same progression: initial normalcy, growing insight, physical symptoms, psychological deterioration, and finally an end that no one understood and no one survived. 17 observers, 17 specimens, 17 variations on the same fate, and nowhere in the records was there any indication that the inquisitors or priests who reviewed these cases had recognized the pattern. Each occurrence was treated as isolated. Each death was attributed to individual weakness or Xenos influence or simple bad fortune. No one had connected them. No one had realized that the Jokaero were not simply being observed. They were doing something to their observers, building something in them, using them for purposes no human had ever comprehended. I should have stopped then. I should have destroyed my records and submitted to the Inquisitor and accepted whatever fate awaited those who had been touched by Xenos corruption. But I had passed the point where stopping was possible. I understood this now. I understood that the pressure behind my eyes and the skill in my fingers and the patterns that danced through my dreams were not symptoms of contamination, but stages of a process, a construction process, as methodical and purposeful as anything XB-17 built in its chamber. I was being assembled. I was being made into something, and some part of me, the part that had grown hungry for those amber eyes, that had begun to see the beauty in those impossible creations, that had started to understand without understanding how I understood, wanted to know what I would become. Day 230 brought the conversation, though calling it a conversation suggests a mutuality that did not exist. I was at my terminal watching XB-17 build something new, a device with 13 focusing lenses arranged in a pattern that hurt to look at directly, when the creature stopped its work and turned to face me. Its amber eyes met mine through the armorglass, through the one-way barrier that should have made such contact impossible, and I felt something shift in my mind, not words, nothing so crude as language, but meaning nonetheless, conveyed through pathways that had been built into me over months of observation, through connections that the small devices I kept destroying had somehow established and maintained. I understood, in that moment, what the Jokaero were: not savants, not instinct-driven biological machines that produced technology without comprehension. They were something far older and far stranger, a species that had learned to build not just devices but builders, to construct not just technology, but the minds that would continue their constructions across time and space. Every Jokaero was a seed. Every observer who watched them long enough became another seed. The devices they built were not random, they were components of something vast. Something that had been under construction for longer than humanity had existed, something that would be completed long after humanity was gone. Each small creation served a purpose. Each artifact I had built and destroyed had been part of a greater pattern. Each moment I had spent watching those orange, furred hands had been time spent being shaped into a tool that would someday build something I could not imagine. The communication lasted only seconds, but it contained more information than I could process, glimpses of a plan that spanned galaxies, impressions of a purpose that made human concerns seem infinitely small, awareness of my own role in a construction so massive that my entire life was merely a single gesture in an endless sequence of assembly. I understood why the previous observers had died. not from corruption, not from weakness. They had simply been completed, finished with their part of the work, their contributions incorporated into the greater pattern. Their minds and bodies no longer needed once they had built what they were meant to build. Some had resisted this completion and been broken by it. Others had embraced it and been subsumed. All of them had served their purpose, whether they knew it or not. And I understood, with a clarity that cut through every defense I had constructed, that I was nearly completed myself. The artifacts I had been building, the ones I kept destroying in desperate denial, were not random practice pieces. They were components. Parts of a device that had been taking shape in my mind for months, that I had been constructing in fragments during every gap in my memory, every hour of lost time, every moment when my hands moved without my consent. The device was almost finished now. Only a few components remained. And once it was complete, once I assembled the final pieces and activated what I had built, I would no longer be Soren Vale. I would be what the Jokaero had made me. What I had been making myself into since the first day I looked into those amber eyes. I left the observation gallery and I did not return. I locked myself in my quarters and I disposed of every material that might be used for construction, every scrap of metal, every crystal, every length of wire. I requested transfer off the perpetual inquiry, citing medical concerns that the ship's medica could not identify but could not dismiss. I submitted reports that contained nothing of what I had experienced, nothing of what I had learned, nothing that might prompt questions I could not answer. I told myself I was escaping. I told myself I could still choose not to complete what I had started. I told myself the pressure behind my eyes would fade and my hands would stop trembling and I would become myself again if I simply stayed away from the creature long enough. I was wrong. The dreams did not stop. If anything, they intensified, becoming so vivid and detailed that I could feel the weight of tools in my hands, could smell the ozone of activated power cores, could hear the precise click of components fitting together with tolerances measured in micrometers. I woke each morning with new calluses on my palms, new scars on my fingers, new exhaustion in my muscles despite sleeping through what should have been restful nights, and the artifacts kept appearing. In my storage locker, under my bunk, inside my boots, my clothing, the meal packets I consumed without tasting. Small devices that served purposes I increasingly understood, components that fit together in ways I could now see clearly, pieces of a puzzle that assembled itself whether I participated consciously or not. Day 300 brought the discovery I had been dreading. I found the main assembly during a gap in time that lasted nearly 4 hours, a gap I had not noticed at the time, that I only recognized afterward when I checked the ship's chronometer and realized how much of my life had disappeared. The device was hidden in a maintenance crawl space behind my quarters wall panel, a space I should not have known existed, accessible only through a panel that had been welded shut years before my assignment. Inside that space, carefully arranged on a platform I had apparently constructed from stolen hull plating, was the machine I had been building for months. It was beautiful. I cannot describe it any other way, cannot pretend that my first emotion upon seeing it was anything other than a fierce and terrible pride. It stood nearly half a meter tall, a lattice of interlocking components that hummed with contained energy, each piece fitting its neighbors with precision that exceeded anything human manufacture could achieve. Focusing crystals arranged in patterns that seemed to shift when viewed from different angles, power conduits that pulsed with light in frequencies my eyes should not have been able to perceive, control interfaces that matched my hands perfectly, that called to my fingers with an attraction I could feel in my bones. I recognized every component. I remembered building none of them, and I understood with sick certainty that the device was nearly complete. 3 components remained unfinished. 3 pieces that my hands had apparently been unable to construct from the materials available aboard the ship. 3 gaps in the lattice that represented the only remaining barrier between who I was and what I was becoming. I counted those gaps carefully. I memorized their shapes. And I told myself that as long as those 3 components remained incomplete, I was still myself, still human, still capable of choosing a different fate than the 17 observers who had come before me. The ship made port at Relay Station Secundus on day 312, taking on supplies and personnel for the next phase of its mission. I had planned to use this opportunity to escape, to transfer to another vessel, to disappear into the station's population, to put as much distance as possible between myself and the Jokaero that had been remaking me. I had prepared documents. I had arranged transportation. I had done everything necessary to ensure I would never return to the perpetual inquiry or its amber-eyed prisoner. And yet, when the transfer shuttle departed without me, I was not surprised. I had known, somewhere beneath my conscious intentions, that I would not be aboard. Instead, I found myself in the station's commercial district, walking through markets I had no memory of entering, searching for items I had not consciously decided to seek. My hands led me. My eyes identified what I needed before my mind understood what I was seeing. Rare crystals from the mines of Vorsk, refined metals from the forge worlds of Segmentum Obscurus, components so specialized that their mere presence in a civilian market suggested black market origins and inquisitorial interest. I purchased them with credits I had not realized I possessed, using accounts I had not known existed, following procedures that someone had taught me without my awareness. And when I returned to the perpetual inquiry with my purchases carefully hidden in my luggage, I felt nothing but the satisfaction of a craftsman who has acquired the materials needed to complete his work. Day 341. I remember this date with perfect clarity because it was the last day I existed as Soren Vale, the last day I could claim any separation between the person I had been and the thing I was becoming. I had been resisting for weeks, fighting against the compulsions that drove me toward the hidden maintenance crawl space, struggling to maintain consciousness during the gaps that would have allowed my hands to work without my oversight, destroying whatever components I could identify before they'd be added to the growing device. But resistance, I had learned, only delayed the inevitable. It could not prevent it. The Jokaero had been doing this for longer than humanity had existed. They understood patience. They understood that every observer eventually completed their purpose, regardless of how long it took, regardless of how desperately they fought. I completed the first of the 3 remaining components on day 341. I did not intend to. I was asleep, or what passes for sleep when your dreams are technical specifications and your rest is labor you cannot remember, and I woke to find the crystal array in my hands, finished and warm from recent work, glowing with the amber light that had haunted me since the first time XB-17's eyes met mine through the armor glass. I had materials for the second component spread around me on my bed. My fingers were already selecting what they needed, already beginning the assembly sequence that would bring me one step closer to completion. And this time, for the first time, I did not try to stop them. I cannot explain why I surrendered. Perhaps I was simply tired, exhausted by months of fighting something I could not defeat, worn down by the constant pressure of resisting imperatives that had been built into my very neurons. Perhaps some part of me had always wanted this, had recognized from the beginning that watching the Jokaero work was not just observation but transformation, that understanding their creations meant becoming one of them. Perhaps I had simply looked into that hidden crawl space, seen the beautiful machine that awaited only completion, and realized that I could no longer imagine walking away from it. Whatever the reason, I let my hands work. I watched them assemble the second component with skill I should not have possessed. And when they finished, when the focusing lens took its place in the lattice and the device hummed with increased power, I felt something that might have been peace. The third component took 3 days. It was the most complex. A control matrix that would serve as the device's interface, that would connect its functions to a user in ways I was only beginning to understand. My hands worked constantly during those 3 days, stopping only when they needed materials I did not possess, resuming whenever I found alternatives or acceptable substitutes. I ate without tasting. I slept without resting. I watched my fingers move with the same detached fascination had once felt watching XB-17, marveling at their precision, admiring their efficiency, wondering at the knowledge they contained that my conscious mind had never acquired. By the end of the 3rd day, the matrix was complete. By the end of the 3rd day, the device was finished. By the end of the 3rd day, I understood finally, completely, irrevocably, what it was for. The device was a transmitter, not a communications device in any conventional sense, not a tool for sending messages across void or through warp. It was something far more fundamental, a machine for transmitting patterns, for copying the configurations that the Jokaero had built into my mind and broadcasting them outward, for seeding the universe with new observers who would someday watch new Jokaero and become new builders and construct new transmitters in an endless chain of reproduction that had been continuing since before humanity crawled from Terra's oceans. Every completed observer built one of these devices. Every device created more observers. Every observer became another link in a chain that stretched back to the beginning of the Jokaero species and forward to the end of time itself. The Jokaero did not build technology. They built builders. They did not create devices. They created the minds that would create devices that would create minds that would create devices, An endless recursive loop of construction that propagated across the galaxy without purpose humans could comprehend. They were not savants performing incomprehensible feats of engineering instinct. They were seeds, planted in the cosmos by something unimaginably ancient, growing through every observer foolish enough to watch them work. And now I was a seed too. Now I was ready to be planted. Now I understood, with the same crystal clarity that had guided my hands through months of hidden labor, what I was meant to do. I activated the device on day 347. The control matrix fit my hands perfectly. Of course it did. I had built it specifically for my grip, had designed every curve and surface to match my fingers. The power core hummed against my palms. The focusing array directed its output toward coordinates I had not consciously chosen, but which I knew somehow were exactly right. And when I completed the activation sequence, when the device pulsed with light that was visible in spectrums beyond normal human perception, when I felt its broadcast spread outward at speeds that defied physics as I understood it, I knew that I had accomplished what I was meant to accomplish. I had built what I was meant to build. I had become what I was meant to become. The broadcast lasted only milliseconds. The device, its purpose served, immediately began to fail, components burning out in sequences that were clearly intentional, self-destruction protocols activating to remove evidence of what had occurred. Within seconds, nothing remained but slag and ash and the burned remnants of months of secret labor. Within minutes, I had disposed of even that residue, leaving no trace that anything had ever existed in the maintenance crawl space except dust and neglected infrastructure. I returned to my quarters, I cleaned my hands, I changed my clothes, and I sat on my bunk and waited for what would come next. I should have died. Every previous observer had died shortly after completing their purpose, their minds burned out by the strain of containing knowledge they were not meant to possess, their bodies failing once they were no longer needed. I had expected this. I had even, in some dark corner of my soul, welcomed it. Death would have been an ending, a release from the terrible awareness of what I had become. Death would have meant that I was finished, that my contribution to the Jokaero's endless construction was complete, that I could finally stop building. But I did not die. The hours passed, and then the days, and I remained alive and aware and terrifyingly unchanged. The pressure behind my eyes faded. The compulsions that had driven my hands ceased. The dreams became ordinary again, confused and meaningless as human dreams are supposed to be. I returned to my duties in the observation gallery, watching XB-17 work on new creations, documenting its behavior with the same systematic precision I had employed before everything changed. From the outside, I appeared normal. From the outside, I was simply Soren Vale, doing the job I had been assigned, showing no signs of the contamination that had consumed 17 observers before me. I survived because I was not finished. I understand this now, 70 days after the transmission, still alive, still watching, still trying to comprehend what I have become. The device I built was not my purpose. It was merely one task in a sequence I am only beginning to perceive. The broadcast I transmitted did not complete my function. It initiated it. Somewhere in the galaxy, my signal has been received. Somewhere new observers are beginning their journeys toward New Jokaero, starting down paths that will lead them to the same transformation I underwent. And my role, the role that keeps me alive, that prevents the merciful destruction that claimed my predecessors, is to ensure that their journeys succeed. I have been making preparations, not consciously, not with intention I can identify, but with the same compelled efficiency that guided my hands through months of hidden construction. I have been documenting what I experienced, not in official reports, which contain nothing useful, but in private records that I hide in places where I know somehow they will eventually be found. I have been cataloging the mistakes of previous observers, identifying the points where their resistance caused them to fail before their time. I have been studying the Perpetual Inquiry's security systems, learning their weaknesses, preparing for occasions when new observers might need assistance reaching their assigned Jokaero. I am no longer a builder of devices. I am a builder of conditions. I am infrastructure. I am support. I watch XB-17 through the armor glass, and I know now that it watches me back, that it has always watched me back, that the barrier between us was never more than an illusion maintained for human comfort. I feel its awareness pressing against my mind, not invasively, not anymore, but as a colleague might observe a fellow worker, checking that tasks are proceeding correctly, that purposes are being served. Sometimes I catch glimpses of what it perceives, vast networks of observers and builders and transmitters stretching across the galaxy, chains of construction that have been accumulating for millions of years, patterns so complex that human minds can only glimpse their edges. The Jokaero are not building technology. They are building themselves. They are growing a species, mind that spans the stars, using human observers as temporary vessels for knowledge that must be passed and preserved and propagated. I do not know how long I will survive. The previous observers died because their purposes ended, because they were no longer needed once their constructions were complete. My purpose seems different, ongoing, supportive, maintaining rather than creating. Perhaps I will survive until I am no longer useful. Perhaps I will survive until the Inquisitor finally recognizes what I have become and terminates my contaminated existence. Perhaps I will survive until the Jokaero's great project reaches some conclusion I cannot imagine. Until the patterns they have been building finally achieve a purpose that has remained hidden for longer than humanity has existed. I am writing this account because it is part of my function. I understand this even as I resist understanding it. Every word I set down serves purposes I cannot perceive, contributes to constructions I cannot comprehend. Some future observer will find these pages and read them, and begin to understand what they are becoming, and that understanding will help them complete their own transformation more efficiently, more successfully, with less resistance and less suffering than I experienced. I am not writing to warn. I am not writing to document. I am writing because the Jokaero have built me to write, because this text is as much a component of their endless construction as any device that emerged from XB-17's miraculous hands. Does the Jokaero know what it is building? The question seems absurd to me now. Of course it knows. It has always known. The question was never about its awareness but about ours, about whether we could perceive the construction taking place around us, whether we could recognize our own role in processes that dwarf human comprehension. I watched XB-17 for 417 days, trying to understand its creations. I never realized that I was the creation it was working on. I never understood that every device it built, every component it assembled, every miraculous emergence of technology from those orange, furred hands was merely distraction, performance, the visible surface of a construction happening entirely in my mind. I understand now. I understand everything except what comes next, what purpose my continued existence serves, what role I will play in the endless chains of building that stretch from the galaxy's beginning to its end. I understand that I am no longer Soren Vale, that the man who began this assignment died somewhere during those 417 days, replaced by something that wears his face and speaks with his voice, but serves purposes he never could have imagined. I understand that resistance is not merely futile but meaningless, that fighting what I have become would be like a hammer fighting its nature, like a circuit refusing to conduct, like a lens demanding not to focus light. The Jokaero knew what it was building me. And now I know what I am building, other versions of myself, other observers who will undergo the same transformation, other links in a chain that will never end because ending is not the point, because the construction is the purpose, because the Jokaero do not build things but processes, not devices but procedures, not technology, but the endless reproduction of the capacity to build. I return to the observation gallery. I take my seat at the terminal. I watch XB-17 work, its amber eyes meeting mine through barriers that no longer exist, its hands assembling miracles that I now understand are messages, instructions, seeds planted in the minds of everyone who watches long enough. I document what I see. I file my reports. I wait for the Inquisitor to assign the next observer, knowing that they will undergo everything I underwent, knowing that I will help them complete their transformation, knowing that when they are finished they will help the next observer, and the next, and the next, until the galaxy is filled with builders and the Jokaero's great construction finally achieves whatever impossible purpose it was always meant to serve. The question was never whether the Jokaero knows what it is building. The question is whether we can ever know what we have been built into. And the answer I am learning is that we cannot, that the construction is too vast, the purpose too alien, the design too far beyond human perception for any of us to comprehend more than our own small part. We are components. We are tools. We are hands that work without understanding, building devices that will build minds that will build devices that will build minds, forever and ever, until the stars burn out and the galaxy grows cold and something finally emerges from the patterns the Jokaero have been weaving since before time began. I am still watching. I will always be watching. And somewhere in the depths of my remade mind, in circuits of thought that were installed without my knowledge or consent, I am still building. We are all still building. That is what we are for. That is what the Jokaero made us to do. And they knew, they always knew. The only ones who never understood were us.